After Krug was destroyed while most of its defenders were at his side, Urza vowed that none of his allies would ever need to fear for their own defense again, even while laying siege to a city far from their homes. From an anonymous annotation in the Antiquities War by Kaila bin Krug, Folio Edizione. Dominaria, present day. Sahili had lost count of how many times she tested the temporal anchor, starting shortly after she arrived on Dominaria just a handful of weeks ago. That first iteration, based heavily on blueprints given to her by Joda, had been an unmitigated disaster. Apparently, the plans had belonged to an old artificer friend of the fairies who he insisted got his contraption to work. Sahili didn't see how. Within 5 minutes, she spotted glaring flaws in the design, many oriented around an alarming lack of protection for the occupant. So, she threw it away and started again. Sadly, her luck didn't change much with her own design. But she couldn't give up. That wasn't an option. Sahili stepped back from her latest version of the temporal anchor, coils shaped like the Aether Whirls that danced high in Kaladesh skies. She flipped a switch on her control board, completing the circuit from the Power Stone, once the power source to a legendary skyship called Weatherlight, to the anchor's central junction. The Power Stone, thrumming with intense white light, flickered as it sent energy through tightly wound copper coils into each subsystem. Sahili's attention remained on the key subsystem at the heart of the anchor, an artifact Teferi jokingly called a coffin, that preserved a person's bodily operations while in stasis. In contrast to the original device detailed in Joda's plans, Sahili's temporal anchor did not transmit matter through the time stream. Instead, it projected a person's spirit backward in time, a function that Teferi insisted upon the bar to Chrononaut himself from interfering in past events. Safely separating a body and a soul was a difficult task, one that Sahili had no experience with. Thankfully, she had Gaia in the fold. By extending her ghost form over the coffin with Teferi inside, Gaia could render him entirely incorporeal, perfect for the anchor to do its work. "Ready?" said Sahili. Gaia nodded and stepped inside the atrium where the coffin was suspended. Both planeswalkers kept their eyes trained on the antenna array atop the anchor, an assembly that forced temporal energies at another of Teferi's artifacts, one he called the Moonsilver Key. None of these names mattered to Sahili. The artifacts were simply components that contributed to a greater whole. The room temperature climbed and humidity swelled as power flowed through the anchor. A sweet, pungent scent filled the air, like after a thunderstorm. Tiny dashes of electricity danced upon the anchor's filigreed edges, inching upward to the antenna array like a swarm of glowworms, a conduit of energy. Like a shaft of light through smoke, began to form between the array and the Moonsilver Key. That was Gaia's cue. Her form became hazy as violet tendrils of magical energy wrapped around her, extending over the coffin and anything that would be contained inside. A moment later, a thin red beam of energy shot from the key to the coffin, filling it with a crimson effluvium. "It's stable!" cried Sahili, but she spoke too soon. A shower of sparks poured out from the bank of circuitry where the Power Stone wires connected to the anchor. No, not again." Sahili flipped the switch to power down the anchor, but it was too late to stop the chain reaction. Gaia leapt out of the anchor and took cover behind an ancient piece of wreckage that Sahili had refashioned into a heat shield. "Sahili," yelled Gaia, "get away from there." Sahili didn't hear her. There was still a chance to salvage this test. If she could quickly figure out what went wrong, she could fix it and cement the anchor's viability. Reaching out with her metalworking abilities, She let her consciousness ride the wires inside the machine. The current like a spirited charger to find exact spot where the disruption started. What the power couplings hadn't simply burst, they had been torn apart. Raw energy poured out from the circuitry, bypassing the resistors that ensured proper power flow. Okay, all I need to do is repair the circuit. She ran over the damaged section and focused her powers on mending the wires. Suddenly, a pulse of white light engulfed the whole area. In the same moment, Sahili felt her entire body grow ice cold. She couldn't breathe, but found that she didn't have to. She looked down to see Kaya gripping her hand, extending her ghost form to protect them both from the explosion. Once her initial bewilderment passed, Sahili noticed something else. Something hovering just a few feet away. She didn't see it as much as feel it. A presence that inspired a profound melancholy in her. Melancholy? Then Kaya let her go, leaving Sahili dizzy and gasping for air. She sat on the floor in front of the anchor, trying to process what she'd just experienced. None of it made sense. She checked every system in the anchor before switching it on. No way a malfunction like that should have happened. And then there was that thing. Kaya, you're going to think I'm crazy. You're not crazy, said Kaya. I saw it too. You did? What do you think it was? I know what it was, and I know what caused it. She led Sahili, careful, to step around the metal shards that had been once part of the anchor to an innocuous looking crate shoved underneath one of the workbenches. There. Sahili pulled out the crate and uncovered it to reveal a black crystal orb encased in a cage of silver. This only confused her more. The fairy gave it to me, along with the other artifacts to create the anchor. He insisted it was important, but I couldn't figure out what it did or even what it was, so I stored it away. Let's find him, said Kaya, because I want to know why this thing is creating ghosts. Sahili recognized a piece by Shanti Makam in the far corner of the room. A cat-sized sculpture of living metal that changed shape in response to the sounds around it. In the center of the fine ebony wood table, she sat was a prototype model of Chitya Rayav's Aether Crucible. A steady trickle of raw blue aether bubbling up from its center. Both one-of-a-kind pieces had been stolen from the Girapur Institute of Art and Science 1 month before. Other baubles of similar opulence decorated the room, all tinged with the fact that they'd been liberated from their rightful owners across the city. The fox had taken her at the perfect time, for them at least. Like most of the population in the city, she had attended the spring festival, replete with dancers in flowing patterned outfits filling the streets with muslin spirals of purple, pink and orange. All strata of society flooded public squares to share food and gossip while fleets of kites fluttered overhead. Her kidnappers merely had to wait amid the raucous chaos until she stepped in front of the right alleyway. The next thing she knew, she woke up tied to a chair in this place. The light was minimal. Small lanterns adorned the tops of tables next to luxurious couches that probably cost more than her house. The two men had grabbed her, stood on either side of her, and across the table from her sat the erstwhile host of this private soiree. Clad all in black, save for a faceplate of finely inlaid gold. With a single hand motion, the host ordered the man to leave. Sahili turned her head to see where they were going when the host stopped her. "Oh, don't look back," said the host in a deep, echoing baritone. "No matter the predicament, you must never turn away from what's most important. Or most dangerous." Sahili Rai youngest artificer to ever be invited to the Institute, daughter to Arav and Ruby, sister to Sheila, Amika and Sahil. A decent, law-abiding citizen of Girapur with a few violations that are common among youth. Is all this correct? You know a lot about me. No, I know everything about you, said the host. But my manners. Such a disparity between us is uncivil. Let me introduce myself. I am Ghonti, Lord of the Night Market. Ha! I knew I chose the right person for this job. But then, who I am is hardly a test for your intellect. Let me give you a better one. Leaning back, Ghonti unfastened the buttons on their shirt, from top to bottom, exposing their chest for Sahili to see. She'd seen Aetherborn's skin up close before, finding it to have the look and feel of smooth chalk. But that's not what she saw under Ghonti's shirt. Their flesh had the look of cracked stone, hard and strong, and embedded in their chest was a metal device made of rotating gears. Thoughts? Yes, she had thoughts. There had always been conjecture on just who Ghonti was, since their reign over Girapur's underworld had lasted, well, longer than Aetherborn's lifespan. Now she had the answer. Am I here to gawk? Hardly. Ghonti reached under the table and produced a small bag, which they slid over to Sahili. She looked inside to discover a suit of tools any artificer would be envious of. Diamond-tipped tweezers, an array of loops, pliers, cutters, and vices, optimized for delicate tasks. My heart, Ghonti said, tapping the mechanism on his chest. It has begun to fail. I don't believe I can adequately describe what it's like to feel yourself wasting away in real time. You're here to fix it. Here was the criminal mastermind of the city, responsible for theft, corruption, and murder. And they brought her here to save their life? No, that wasn't happening. Sahili could bring about more peace in Girapur than the consulate ever had by doing nothing. I think it's beyond my knowledge to help, she said. I'm sorry. You disappoint me. I thought you'd be eager to explore such a rare invention. But I can say this wasn't expected. Ghonti reached into the front pocket of their shirt, pulled out a slim golden chain and slid it across the table. Sahili caught it and held it up to look at it. Gold shaped into ivy with amethyst flowers. This was her mother's bracelet. She'd know it anywhere. What is the meaning of this? Don't play the fool, said Ghonti. It's quite obvious. My associates have already gathered your family members inside your place of residence. If I don't send word in the allotted time, their instructions are to execute everyone, starting with your mother. Sahili clutched her mother's bracelet and pressed it to her forehead. You're a monster. One with little time to spare, much like yourself. The ferry was nowhere to be found, but Sahili and Kaya were able to track Joda down in one of the many unused chambers inside the tower. He sat on the ground with his legs folded, speaking into what looked like a cloud of shimmering mercury that hung in the air. You're such a mother, he said to the person appearing inside the cloud. A woman with tan skin and dark red streaked hair. The ferry's fine. Better than fine, all things considered. You still bent on going back? Asked the woman. Joda threw his arms up. There isn't much of a choice. Time travel, she said, shaking her head. I hope he knows what he's doing. It could be worse. He could have decided to go back and talk too. Standing in the doorway with Kaya, Sahili cleared her throat loudly. Joda looked up from his conversation. He put on an uneasy smile and held up his hand in a one moment gesture. Jorah, I've got to go, he said, standing up. Give my love to Adelice. You could contact her yourself, you know. Yes, but then we'd have to catch up and explain our current projects. Something inevitably would come up, Cutting our chat short, and by the time we could resume, so much would have happened that we'd have to do it all over again. You two are so alike, it's annoying. You mean endearing, right? No, she said as the cloud began to dissipate. Take care of yourself, Joda. You too. Joda turned to the planeswalkers waiting at the door. My apologies, what can I do for you? Saheeli didn't mince words. We believe that a spirit has been sabotaging the temporal anchor and that is being created by whatever this black orb is that the fairy gave me. Wait, slow down, Joda said. Exactly how does one create ghosts? I mean, apart from the obvious way of, killing people. Maybe creating is the wrong word, said Gaia. More like strengthening a spirit that's already there. The longer a spirit is left on the physical plane, the more indistinct it becomes, like a mist in the breeze. Unless something comes along to give it enough energy to fully form again. I saw a silver cord extending from the orb to the spirit, a direct channel of physical energy. Assuming you're right, Joda began, couldn't you just move the orb out of the workshop? Even take it away to another plane? It's been around for weeks, said Gaia. The spirit has been gorging itself that whole time. It could take centuries before it dissipates enough to leave us alone. Joda accompanied them back to the scene of the incident to give his own impressions. When they arrived, Saheeli gingerly led Joda around the sharp debris to show him the fairy's mysterious orb. He touched the silver cage with his fingers and poked the crystal orb inside with the end of his staff. Soft lights inside the orb winked in and out of existence. He prodded a bit more before taking the orb and turning it over to look at its underside. He ran his fingers over the same small patch of silver again and again. Damn it, Ursa, he said, hanging his head. What have you done now? Who? Asked Gaia. Ursa, he replied, the man who built this tower. The planeswalker who vanquished the Phyrexians when they invaded this plane a millennia ago. The fairy's teacher and my ancestor. And you didn't say anything about it because? Because family matters are rarely simple. Joda placed the orb onto the table, uttered the spell and gathered the others around to see part of the orb's silver cage begin to glow red. I don't suppose you noticed the script hidden in the silver mesh. Saheeli hadn't, but with Joda's spell she could plainly see a faint inscription. Even if she hadn't seen it before, she would have dismissed the series of geometric shapes laid on top of each other, squares, triangles and circles repeating and overlapping with no discernible pattern, as an artificer's signature. It's the written language of the Thran, an ancient civilization on this plane, said Joda. Few people alive in the last 5,000 years could read their language. I can. Ursa and the other Talarians under his tutelage could as well. I have little doubt that this orb is his doing. What does the message say? Go back to the beginning and greet me properly. What does that mean? Asked Saheeli. Could it be Ursa disrupting the anchor? For many reasons, I'm confident that Ursa is not the spirit in question, answered Joda. As for the meaning of the message, all I know for sure is if Ursa is involved, it's probably trouble. Another evasive answer, Saheeli noted. While she hadn't known Joda for as long as the fairy or certainly members of the Gatewatch, she would have linked to think the past few weeks together had engendered some manner of rapport between them. They'd eaten together, chatted over tea, exchanged stories. They were on Dominaria ostensibly working toward a common purpose of thwarting the Phyrexians, a threat that endangered countless planes, including her own. There was no room for hiding such important information. All the more reason to take care of this thing quickly, said Gaia, and permanently. Hold on, said Saheeli. That spirit was once a living being, right? Wouldn't it be better if we could find out what it wants? Gaia sunk into her seat. Lingering spirits only want a few things, most of them bad, but I'll hear you out. What do you propose? The way you talked about them before, it was as if they were energy beings. Sure, said Gaia. What's the soul but energy driven by will? Exactly. I think I have something that could help us deal with our visitor." Incredible, Sahili blurted out before she could stop herself. The last thing she wanted to give Ghonti was the satisfaction of being right about her. Despite the circumstances, a part of her was thrilled to examine such a marvel of engineering so closely. The heart didn't merely prolong Ghonti's existence, a feat to be sure, but nothing compared to what it constituted. At the center of the heart was a honeycomb-shaped module that pulled aether directly from the atmosphere. Fresh, raw aether continually circulated through Ghonti, renewing their body forever. In short, Ghonti was immortal. How much longer? Ghonti asked. They lay still, a model of a patient upon their expansive boardroom table. Ghonti didn't so much as twitch as she probed and prodded them. "It's a delicate process," said Sahili, lifting feather-light, semi-transparent membranes inside the heart with tapered tweezers. "It requires all my concentration." "Not all," they said. "Your dedication to your craft, to your family, is certain, but I can also sense your rebelliousness ascend like cut cloths." Sahili quietly cursed. Like all the other Aetherborn she'd encountered, Ghonti had the ability to read emotions and interpret them as various scents. Here, with no one else around, it was impossible to hide even her deepest thoughts. It is understandable. Conflict is the natural state of things, even within an individual. Easy for you to say when you steal and kill for a living. How amusingly naive. Naive? Where were they when the consulate sweeps rounded up the homeless to satisfy the aristocrats seeking scapegoats for crimes Ghonti and his cronies committed? How many innocents were caught in the crossfire between warring factions of Ghonti's own people squabbling over profits? And how many more lived in fear of losing their homes and livelihoods to their greed? She turned back to the heart, but like before, she couldn't stop herself from saying what was on her mind. "I wish we could live in peace without you destroying our lives." Ghonti's tone grew grim. "I remember a time when my kind were hunted like animals. People knew what we were. They just were very irritated that we were. Do not talk of destroyed lives when you have no idea what that means." Sahili wanted to rebut Ghonti, but what could she say? They were right. The first Aetherborn were chased and killed by engineers who dismissed them as a side effect of Aether refinement. A mistake. Yes, things had changed for the better, but what of the past? How does the society repair that kind of damage? She didn't have the answers, and it wasn't her place at the moment to pursue them. All she could do was protect her family the best she could. Digging deep into Ghonti's chest, she located the problem. The core of the Aether heart was comprised of a resolving silver filament no bigger than a fingernail. The filament's motion governed the cadence with which the gears churned Aether, much like a human heart pumped blood in regular intervals. A small fracture in the filament had developed over time, the simplest of repairs to make. Sahili tapped her finger on the filament, its surface rippling like water until the crack was healed. "I fixed the damage," said Sahili. "Do you feel any different?" At first, Ghonti was silent. Slowly, they sat up and turned to her. "I feel magnificent." "Then tell your man to stand down." "I already did," said Ghonti as they buttoned up their shirt. "Those two I sent before we began talking conveyed the message. Your family was never in any danger. Consider it an act of faith in you." Sahili began shaking, not out of anger, but of joyful relief. Ghonti hopped off the table, stopping to lament a scuff mark on the surface. They extended a hand for Sahili to take, which she did, not wanting to anger Ghonti enough to place her family back into danger. They led her to a window at the far rear of the room, drawing back the curtains. Ghonti revealed a stunning view of Girapur, its high spires decorated with lights for the spring festival. Down below, thousands reveled in the streets. "My city. Beautiful, isn't it? We are allied now, but make no mistake. It brought its war to me first, like it did all Aetherborn. Instead of grumbling, I embraced its thick, spiny hide. To win a war, you must become the war. That is the way of things. Dominaria, present day. Saheeli flipped the power switch on the temporal anchor for the second time that day. The apparatus charged up in its normal fashion, energy routing from the power stone into the rest of the anchor. Kaya in place waiting for her part to play out. Looking around the workshop, she wondered if the spirit was lurking unseen, watching her every action. She hoped so. Kaya, are you ready? Saheeli called out. Yes, she said, placing her hands on the coffin. I hope this works. The energy conduit began to materialize between the antenna array and the moon silver key. Saheeli kept still, her gaze locked on Kaya. The only movement she dared to make was to slide her finger from the power switch on her control board to a second one. Kaya became incorporeal, filling the anchor's atrium with violent wisps of magic. Everything had to seem like they were just trying another test. That was the bait. Where are you? Saheeli wondered. It's here, yelled Kaya. Do it now. Saheeli flipped the second switch, shunting power from the anchor's normal operations to a newly built subsystem. Instead of absorbing and directing the antenna signal, the moon silver key began to resolve, causing the air in the room to feel thick. A greenish fog rose from the floor as a sudden nausea bubbled up from her stomach, forcing her to lean on her work table. There, in front of the anchor, a grey shape began to take form like frost on a plain of gas. Limbs defined themselves, as did a head and torso. Then more, the face of a man, worn and tired, his beard unshorn and white. A heavy suit of armor emblazoned with the head of a lion. Who are you? Saheeli yelled, pushing herself to her feet. Shock streaked across the spirit's face. It turned to flee but found itself slowed, unable to take more than a few halting steps away from the anchor. Saheeli's trap worked. By replicating the cadence of energy pumping through ghonti's aether heart, Saheeli had succeeded in giving the spirit a semblance of solidity. Without its ability to dissolve or pass through solid barriers, it would have no choice but to communicate with her. We don't mean to hurt you. Tell us what you want. The spirit hesitated, allowing her to extend her hand in a sign of friendship. It responded by shoving her to the ground, its touch frigid, like freshly turned dirt on a grave. Unbuckling like a ghostly blade from its belt, the spirit raised its weapon above its head. Kaya sprang into action, diving to the floor to pull Saheeli out of harm's way. But Saheeli was never its target. The blade struck the anchor, gouging a deep gash into its side. Kaya hurled the blade at the spirit, but it had already fled out the workshop door. Are you alright? She asked Saheeli. Kaya's concern didn't fully mask her frustration. She had been doubtful about Saheeli's attempt at communication and turned out to be right. I'm not hurt. Good. Make sure the anchor is okay. I'm going after it. Kaya bolted out the door, leaving Saheeli to assess the anchor. While the damage was severe, the power stabilization subsystem had been hacked to pieces. The key and the coffin were untouched. Repairs would be extensive but doable. Saheeli sighed, but the relief was short-lived. She hurried to the door to track Kaya down, hoping to reach her before the ghost assassin. It had understood her. If the situation were calmer, a dialogue was possible. Saheeli ran through the tunnels connecting the workshop to the tower proper, emerging into the corridor that encircled the main hall. She spotted Joda across the way, while she and Kaya were working to modify the anchor. He'd sequestered himself with the starfield orb to glean any answers he could. Where is Kaya? She called out. I saw her go upstairs, said Joda. Follow me. Saheeli and Joda ran up the second floor of the ornery, where they saw Kaya, daggers in hand, face to face with the partially solid spirit. its own chunky, squarish blade held at the ready. "It's disintegrating fast," said Gaia. "If we don't take care of it now, it will be a lot harder to pin down." Gaia was right if the goal was to destroy the spirit, but Sahili clung to the notion that a peace could be reached. She knew it was foolish. She knew it had cost them precious time, but the thought of inflicting needless harm did not sit well with her. "My name is Sahili Rai," she said. "What's yours?" "Sharaman," the spirit said, keeping his weapon raised. "General Sharaman," said Yoda, "the leader of Ursa's armies." "Are you here on behalf of that snake?" said Sharaman, his form wavering. "Your war is almost 5,000 years over with," said Yoda. "If this is about revenge..." "Not revenge, preservation. You would restart Ursa's war machine." "I'm sorry for what happened to you," said Sahili, "but the fight... They are a threat to all the people of Dominaria and planes beyond. I served Ursa faithfully for decades. My nephews, good boys, I cradled their corpses split apart by Mishra's dragon engines." His form became hazier as the effects of Sahili's trap weakened. "I stood by while he ordered the sacking of Sardia and other provinces that wouldn't give over their resources. I thought that history would forgive us because we were the righteous ones." He looked straight at Sahili. "I will not let anyone repeat the mistakes I made. If that means stopping you, I will do so." She didn't know what to do. Sharaman wasn't just some temperamental spirit. He had lost so much, his family, his life. She had to convince him that their efforts were necessary. "Sharaman, there must be some way." Gaia didn't wait for Sahili to finish. As Sharaman faded from view, she activated her ghost form and lunged at the spirit, her ethereal form swelling into a wave of death. She swung out with her daggers, parrying a strike that only she could see, then spun around with a backward stab. Sahili watched as Gaia dropped her weapon and knelt. Gaia's lips moved, but Sahili heard no sound. She walked to where Gaia was kneeling and waited for her to rematerialize. Gaia stood up, visibly shaken. "I'm sorry. He didn't give us much choice." The fairy rested his head against the bedding inside the coffin, his smiling face visible through a small porthole. He'd been surprisingly good spirits when he came in for the test, a far cry from his pensiveness during his morning visit. Sahili hoped that she could find the solace that he'd somehow found. A quiet walk around the tower environs, perhaps. Yes, that could help. Sahili did her final review of the temporal anchor. All subsystems checked out, both old and new. She nodded to Gaia, giving her the go-ahead to step into the anchor for what she hoped would be a successful run. Ever since the confrontation with Sharaman, Gaia's usual swagger had been missing. "Are you sure you are okay to do this now?" asked Sahili. "This is too important to delay." "That wasn't my question." She smiled. "I wish I was more like you, a good person." "You are a good person, Gaia," said Sahili. She shook her head. Sharaman wasn't ever going to relent. That's how spirits are. Their obsessions are what root them to the physical world. Those I dealt with before, they were tyrants, villains, the worst of the worst. I could justify giving them the punishment they deserved, but him? Did he say something to you at the end? He wanted to know if he would see his family again, said Gaia. I told him that he would. With that, Gaia stepped into the anchor and got into position. Let's do this. Sahili switched on the anchor. It whirred to life. Energy channeled upward to the antenna, then through the moonsilver key, and finally into the coffin containing the fairy within Gaia's ghost form. The anchor was going to work. Sahili knew it already. Turning away for just a moment, Sahili allowed her thoughts to wander. She thought back to that night on Kaladesh years ago, walking into the city after leaving Ghonti's estate. Tables of hot food and cold drinks, maintained by servo constructs. A gaggle of her younger cousins who, by the look of their costumes, had taken part in the spring dances for the first time. The warmth she felt in her family's embrace, a warmth that enveloped her like a single finger stroke on the back of a hand, like measured steps upon Ravnican cobblestones, like Huatli's lips, the most perfect in all the universe, forming the words, "I will come dance with you." Unlike ghonti, Sahili hadn't given up peace, but if those she loved needed her to, she would become the war. Epilogue. The fairy had mentioned the Starfield orb to Joda once, explaining how he had obtained it in one of the hidden caches Ursa left behind sometime during the Phyrexian invasion. But he downplayed the orb's significance. Maybe it had confounded him. No, it was more likely that the fairy erred on the side of wisdom by assuming the orb was too dangerous to fiddle with. Joda would have done the same, especially after detecting the use of soul energy in the orb's enchantments. No wonder it affected spirits like it did. Ursa had truly fallen into dark practices in his final days. Joda regretted not being forthright with the others about the orb, of Ursa, and the tower, for that matter. He'd done it to protect them, but he still disliked keeping secrets from his allies, Sahili especially. In Joda's estimation, she was the perfect collaborator for Teferi to have recruited for their efforts. Adept yet compassionate, unlike so many of the planeswalkers he dealt with over the centuries. Even the ones he held dear, like Freyalise eventually. Sahili's humanity always shone through. She was a better person than he or Teferi had been in their youth. Hours past midnight, Joda sat at the base of one of the outer watchtowers, the Starfield orb in the ground in front of him. If anyone was going to put himself at risk to investigate one of Ursa's many schemes, it was going to be him. He began to cast a spell. It was child's magic. Joyra was the first to show it to him when they'd been more than the distant friends they were today. She had grown tired, as she often did, of his pedantic complaints about this professor or that Tolaria West. So she cast a spell on him, shocking him into silence. Between the bouts of laughing, she explained that it was the very first spell she'd learned from Teferi, one that jolted a person with a rather strong electric shock. It was infamous among the students of Tolarian Academy, the professors too. Eventually learned to refrain from shaking Teferi's hand. Yes, that included Ursa. Go back to the beginning and greet me properly. Joda held his hand out, directing the shock at the orb. In a blue flash the world vanished, replaced a moment later by the interior of an austere cottage. The room was illuminated, but there didn't seem to be any origin for the light. Joda found himself seated at a grand table. On top, a vast array of toy figurines, almost impossibly small, soldiers, some on horseback, against a squadron of mechanical dragons, were in simulated battle. "Ursa, you old git," he said softly, "a pocket dimension, and not just any. The pocket dimension was made to resemble the cabin Ursa lived in more than 1,000 years before. It had been located in the Oran Mountains on the Isle of Golmani, a fact Joda knew because he'd paid it a visit once upon a time. He got up to look over a tall bookshelf packed with thick manuscripts, recognizing the names of several volumes long thought lost. One caught his eye. He plucked it off the shelf and inspected the cover, sinking his fingertips into the worn grooves in the leather. Calfskin emblazoned with a lion's head, the symbol of Argive, he noted. Flipping through the pages, he stopped on the diagram of an ornithopter, pointing out the small capital T in the corner of the page. Stamped woodcuts of original illustrations by the artificer Taunus. Then he turned to the title page. The Antiquities War by Kyla bin Krook. A voice behind him announced. Joda spun around to see a woman in the padded armor, her hair pulled back from her angular face. "That's the folio edition," she said, produced to commemorate the first gathering of the sages of Minarat. There are several copies of this work on the shelf, all different editions, from scroll to tome. I know you, said Joda. Xantia, you were Ursa's companion. In my dreams, I am Xantia, the woman said, but I am not her. Everything she was is contained within the golem. Garn. What are you then? A construct, like all you see here. Joda had met the real Xantia briefly. She was curious, almost like a child, and asked him all manner of questions about Dominarian history and distant lands. Joda remembered thinking how odd a pairing she and Ursa made, but also that her presence seemed to mollify the most abrasive parts of his personality. A door at the far side of the room opened, and stepping inside was another individual. This one a man, stout and severe, with dark hair and a hairy brow. Flipping back through the antiquities again, Joda arrived at a portrait that matched the man. Mishra, said Joda, you are a construct as well. You do not match the description of the fairy, Mishra said before drawing a short sword and pointing it at Joda. You're an intruder. Hold, Xantia ordered, then turned to Joda. Who are you and what is your purpose here? My name is Joda, friend of the fairies and descendant of Ursa, said Joda. How else would I have gained access to this place? That seemed to satisfy them. They stood down, allowing Joda to continue examining the bookshelf. He placed back the antiquities war and picked out a roughly bound file of pages from the very bottom shelf. This was a collection of schematics, plans, all the instructions needed to rebuild Ursa's army of Yotian soldiers and clay statues. A smaller folder within the file contained even more arcane information on familiar lineages, along with the grand design of disparate objects all united into a singular weapon. The legacy, said Joda. This whole place, it's Ursa's failsafe in case he perished before he could deploy it against the Phyrexians. He laughed, remembering what the fairy had said about obtaining the orb. It was like Ursa targeted every weakness of mine, but I beat him. No one ever beat Ursa at any kind of mind game. He put nigh impossible obstacles in front of the orb because he knew that only the fairy would have the mettle and audacity to overcome them. Joda closed the file and held his hand on the cover. Xantia and Mishra had been watching him the entire time, their blank expressions never changing. The fairy has his hands full right now, he told them, but when all of that has passed and when he's ready, I will tell him about this place. In the meantime, did your master leave any final words? Yes, said Mishra, let us end our conflicts. We cannot afford to differ any longer.